Mardle presents Sorry for Your Loss, written by Kate Marshall and Linda Watson-Brown, and read by Catherine Harvey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Mardle. This book is dedicated to everyone who has lost someone, particularly those who were denied the chance to say goodbye. And as always, to my amazing family. Love you all, bibbies. Whilst all of the stories within this memoir are true, names have been changed, as have some of the background details. We all deserve respect, and that shouldn't stop when we are dead. Before, early 2019. I didn't start with the dead. I started with hoarders. What do you think I should expect? Well now, let's see. Houses that are death traps due to the sheer quantity of accumulated rubbish. Rooms that are crammed from floor to ceiling with enough orders from QVC to keep them going for decades. People lying in their own filth, surrounded by takeaway boxes who couldn't find a path to the kitchen if their lives depended on it. More animal feces than you'd see in a zoo. That sort of thing. Here you go. With those words from my new boss, Gina, I was handed an industrial boiler suit, a mask, and thick gloves. This was my job now. I was going to help people who hoarded, encourage them to clear their houses, and hopefully change their lives. I learned very quickly that the clients don't think you're there because they're living in squalor. They don't think they're hoarding in the first place, so most don't identify as hoarders. They think that any help they are given is for something small, maybe a pile of boxes they can't manage to move that is a health hazard, or perhaps the dishes need doing, the ones that have been sitting there for 3 years. There was hardly ever an acknowledgement that their compulsion was completely out of hand. It was always just a few things, a bit of a muddle. There were always excuses, too. The bins only got emptied twice a month, and the neighbours filled them up anyway. Everything would get used at some point, or someone else might need it. The company might stop making it, or it might run out. Within my first few weeks, I felt like I'd heard it all. One man had his wall recesses lined with empty wine bottles. "What's with that then, Colin?" I asked. "My collection," he asked, smiling with pride. "A lot of them are very rare, you know. They're worth a lot of money, so you be careful. They'll be worth a fortune one day." I looked at his collection of hundreds of dusty Skol Lager and Blue Nun empties and wondered how to break the news. Then realised there was no news to break, as Colin wouldn't be getting rid of these in a hurry. Clients would consistently tell me that they had no time to make a start on things, even though they were in bed all day, and most never left the house. "Where'd you keep the bin bags?" I'd ask breezily. "I just need to pop a few things out." "No point in buying them, love," I'd be told. "You ever tried to open one of those buggers?" Cat litter trays quickly became my nemesis. I've got a strong stomach, but every time I saw one brimming over, maggots wriggling, I'd heave. There was rarely just one. Instead, there would be a few, as, rather than empty and clean what was there, they tended to get another, but never throw the old one out. They'd be teeming with white, crawling things, like some horrific science experiment in the kitchen. "I don't think I can face another cat litter tray," I told Gina. "Anyone with a non-maggot issue, by any chance?" She flicked through her files wearily. Where to start? Oh, here we go. Lena, she's lovely. I did her assessment, really nice old lady, and no cats. Lena was indeed lovely, and at least everything was in a box. Everything. I squeezed down the hallway with boxes on either side into the spare room, which had about 40 kettles, more toasters, and even more George Foreman grills. "You've got a lot of kettles there, Lena," I mentioned, as if it was just a passing comment. Just in case, love, just in case, she told me, with an extremely serious expression. What's the story there, then? There was always a story. You won't believe this, but can you imagine there was one time when my kettle broke, and on the very same day, so did my friend Hetty's. What a day that was, what a day. I'll never be in a pickle like that again. Now, if that ever happens to you, love, you know where to come. And the grills? What about them? I always say you just can't beat a George Foreman grill. They come in a lot of different types, you know. I knew now. What about we sell a few of these? Make you a bit of cash. That would be good, wouldn't it? Lena looked at me warily. How many were you thinking of? Maybe we could keep one and sell the rest. I didn't know until that day just how many different George Foreman grills existed in the world. We couldn't sell that one because it was a 2-slice. We couldn't sell that one because it was a 4-slice. We couldn't sell that one because it was non-stick. We couldn't sell that one because it was a nice box. We couldn't sell that one because Lena had heard it was very hard to come by. We couldn't sell any of them. A bit of shifting about, and Lena was sure we'd done a grand job. How about a cup of tea to celebrate? She asked. Well, we wouldn't be short of a kettle. Of course, it wasn't about toasters or grills. It was about loss and not wanting to let go. It was about keeping some tiny sliver of control in a world that was becoming increasingly scary for an old woman like Lena. Genuine hoarders had tangible items. It wasn't about cleaning, as some of them actually had spotless houses. They just couldn't move for stuff. It was this stuff which gave them more comfort than the need to be able to move around their own house. They often had trauma in their background, but their circumstances were different to the clients whose homes were filthy, the people who had never really cleaned. The years of lying in their own muck just accumulated. These clients had generally given up on life. There would often be alcohol and drug issues, relationships had broken down, and there were no family or friends in the picture. They saw no one from one day until the next. I found that these were usually younger people, and there was a pattern of simply not moving from the couch or bed unless it was to get food or alcohol. One man had hundreds of plastic milk bottles filled with urine. He lay on his bed day after day, a bed that wasn't fit for a dog, just watching TV, smoking, and not even bothering to get up for the loo. Judging by the smell of the house, there were the results of other bodily functions being left about the place as well. He was completely desensitized to how disgusting it was. The smell of cat urine, which made my eyes sting. The curtain of flies, which hung over everything. He'd previously been given assistance and cleaned out 3 times. Skips had been brought in, and, as usually happens, once it's all cleared, everything underneath is ruined. He'd been given new floors, new furniture, and the whole house had been painted. But no help was given to break the cycle. It was uninhabitable again within 12 months, and the whole process would start all over again as soon as I left. That's not okay. I quickly realised that these people needed support, they needed help, and the real things in life. A reason to get up in the morning and a sense of self-worth, not a debit card with autofill details for every website. It's so easy to get things online now, with shopping channels available every minute of every day. All the overseas selling websites, the cheapandnasty.com brigade, are a dream come true for people who have little to look forward to in life other than the arrival of tat from China that appears as if by magic. The addiction of getting deliveries, the rush that comes when they hear the van or the postie, gives them something they might not be getting from anything else. Clients would tell me that they hadn't gone looking for things, bargains had just popped up and they couldn't resist. Some of them started Christmas shopping in January, buying as much stuff in sales as they could without ever really knowing who it was for. Constant sales in the shops and online stores facilitate this sort of behaviour, as there is always some great reduction on something to be had, never mind if it's needed or not. It's gradual. You don't wake up one day with a house like that. There were times when, doing big clean-ups, I'd find envelopes filled with cash and £10 notes under the sofa, and yet no one in the house was eating that night. Other people would say they were too skint to buy a bottle of kitchen cleaner, but they'd order takeaways every night. It was almost as if they'd disconnected from the true value of things, and life was just a meaningless search for instant, fleeting pleasures. I did enjoy helping people, and I did become immune to most of the sights and smells after just a few weeks, but there was such frustration with the sticking plaster approach. I knew that my work was just a temporary fix that wasn't addressing the real problem. Sometimes I could even see rooms filling up while I was there. I'd sort one room, move on to the next, with the client behind me rescuing some of the discarded rubbish quicker than I could get rid of it. One woman had piles of newspapers floor to ceiling, filling one entire room. I now know that you can get 4,000 in one pile. They were all vitally important, apparently. Every single one. But they were never looked at, and the bugs teeming out in all directions meant that they would disintegrate as soon as they were moved, anyway. This type of hoarder tended to be older women, while it was men in the 20 to 50 age group who were the hardest to help. They would fall into the dirty category rather than the hoarding one, and what they hoarded was mess. Almost without exception, they would be drinkers, smokers, or drug users. They generally have no social circle and say that they had no need to engage with anybody. They often used pornography all day, every day, and had lost all connection with the real world. Bottles, cans, cigarette butts would all pile up around them, and they couldn't care less. With some people, almost always women, I could see there was a fluid line between personal possessions and junk, but this was different. Even with filthy houses, the ones I'd been warned about, I never go straight in with my boiler suit and gloves on. These were people who needed to make a connection, and there wouldn't be a chance of any progress if they thought I was judging them from the first visit. Of course, some people couldn't be helped. Some wouldn't even answer me, but the ones who gave me a glimmer of hope made it worthwhile. Let's make tiny baby steps, I'd suggest. Next time, I'll wear protective clothing, just to make sure all your precious things don't come to harm. That would give me a reason to come in my full garb, without making them feel awful. At the start, I genuinely thought I could make a difference. I thought a clean room would stay a clean room, but 99.9% of the clients would never, could never, for many of them, change. The rule was that none of us was allowed to throw anything away unless the person had explicitly agreed to it going. It was like negotiating a UN treaty. I'd sit with them for 3 or 4 hours, and they'd accept me throwing out the dirty cotton buds on the floor. One woman kept her baby in a high chair all day, as there was a sea of rubbish underneath, but she only allowed me to pick up some filthy tissues. I'd suggest filling a box with things for a car boot sale, as many of them claimed that was why they were saving things. But at the end of it, there would be no more than a couple of bits of cardboard and some flyers put aside. It was so slow, like plaiting sawdust. There's no denying that there was a huge amount of frustration with the job, but when there was satisfaction, it was heartwarming. One woman had lost her son. Martha had been his carer, and she'd lived off toasties when he was alive, as there was no time to make meals for herself. When he died, She hoarded toasty and panini machines. I couldn't see the floor for them. I couldn't even see a chair. People often accumulate medication, and Martha had 6 bottles of morphine down the side of the sofa, just in case. That was a phrase I heard so often, and it was a safety net, really. Just in case. Just in case. It took 4 weeks of visits and talking, but she ended up engaging so well, we cleared the whole ground floor. I really did feel that Martha would stick to what we planned and build on what had been achieved. But what she needed more than anything was bereavement counselling and support. Without her son, she had nothing. She had no purpose, and tidying up wasn't going to solve that. People weren't living their lives, and I felt the only difference I could make was being a presence, talking to them. But it was a box-ticking exercise for the housing authority. There was no joined-up thinking at all between services. There was also no distinction made between hoarding urine or hoarding toasters. But there is. There's a huge difference. Some people would move on to have a life if they were given what they were crying out for. Some people would rather live in their own filth, no matter what was offered. It was a temporary fix, without putting support in place. I could walk away, but they were still sat in filth. They'd given up on themselves and their environment. A nice life was something for other people. So many people hadn't even used their own bathroom in years. The number of people who used carrier bags instead of the toilet was unbelievable. Other people would have their cooker or toilet or fridge full of other things: shoes, power tools, collectibles. One lady had done beautiful crafting 30 years ago: cards and crochet, embroidery and frames. She'd become a widow at a young age, never crafted again, but continued to buy everything for crafting, filling rooms from floor to ceiling. The bathroom was piled high with die-cutting machines, each of them worth hundreds of pounds. It looked like a warehouse in there. She had one-day syndrome, as so many clients did. One day, she'd get back to it. One day, she'd use everything. I started thinking about these people and their lives all the time. I felt guilty if I enjoyed myself. I sat in my completely uncluttered house after a day's work and thought that I didn't deserve it. Why did some people draw the short straw in life? I thought about it constantly. The worry was relentless and I was exhausted. One day, it just became too much. Sent to a client called Clive, I walked in and it felt like Groundhog Day. Piles of newspapers in the hallway, half-eaten pizza boxes lying on every surface, the usual bottles filled with yellow liquid, the all-too-common stench of something that I knew needed to be in the toilet rather than down the back of the sofa where Clive lay, immobile and immersed in something vile on his phone. I looked around me at the chaos and despair. This is no way to live, I thought. And I wasn't just talking about Clive. Something had to change. My life had to change. I had to discover what mattered and where I could make a difference. Chapter 1, May 2019. Life wasn't being lived by so many, and I was massively disillusioned by the lack of support. If support had been in place in any effective way, lots of these people could have had their worlds completely changed. I'd always wanted to help people with their mental state. My previous job had been in mental health. Again, there was very little support, and I knew that would have to be at the heart of any new role I took on. An inordinate amount of people never get over loss, and I had a feeling that was the key to whatever move I'd make. I'd worked in a coroner's office in the past, seeing and hearing some awful things, but also knew that I was comfortable with death. When a temporary job came up to work in bereavement services attached to a hospital, I applied. As soon as they knew I'd worked at the coroner's office, I was interviewed on the same day, and I felt a sense of belonging from the start. After the interview, the manager of bereavement services and I had a chat in the family room. This is a small seating area where the family of the deceased collect paperwork or wait before viewing the body. There was a double door to the office, covered with blinds, that led to the viewing room. Through that was another door, which took you to the mortuary itself. "Do you want me to show you around?" asked Wendy, the manager. An undertaker had just dropped a body off, and I could see it through the doors as the blinds were open. I realised at that point that there's a human instinct to say, "I'm so sorry." There was no one to say sorry to. Neither Wendy nor the undertaker had any link to this person. But from that moment, I was aware of the automatic reactions we have to death in our society. I'd seen countless dead bodies at the coroner's office, so that side of things wasn't shocking or upsetting to me. I had watched post-mortems before and seen police body camera and CCTV footage of suicides. I believed that the body is just a casing, not the essence of someone. It's just the packaging. In fact, it had always fascinated me that you can be here one minute, so entrenched in life, and gone the next. Within 6 weeks, I was there, working in the mortuary. That was it. That was my new job. And I had no idea that my life was about to change in ways I could never imagine. Working at a coroner's office, if someone has died in hospital, you have to ascertain their medical background and complete some admin. But in the mortuary, there was so much more. It wasn't just the paperwork I'd have to collate. I would also be liaising with medical staff, funeral directors, the registrar's office, and any other agencies that were involved. Bereavement services isn't counselling, which is often what people think is suggested by the name. It's more of a signpost for the next stage of the process if someone dies in hospital. I was thrown in at the deep end, and there was a lot to take in. If a patient passes on the ward, someone, usually a nurse, will tell the family to come to us, Wendy told me. It's the ward staff who do the last office's checklist. This just means the procedures performed to the body of the deceased. They'll confirm that all responses have been tested, such as breathing and reflex. They'll remove any jewellery, and when they come to us, they'll be in whatever clothing they were in when they died. Next, I had to get to grips with the layout of a medical certificate. Part 1. 1A. The disease or condition immediately causing death. 1B. Other diseases or conditions that caused 1A. 1C. Any other diseases or conditions that led to 1B. Part 2. Other significant existing conditions contributing to the death. Wendy went on to explain, the usual process is that one of the nurses tells the family to contact the bereavement office. Someone will explain the process to them and arrange for the collection of the medical certificate. This isn't something they can do immediately, as it takes some time to complete. The body gets sent to the mortuary via the porters, and their notes go with them. The family gets assigned a bereavement officer. That's you now, Kate. You're one of the team, and you'll be one of their first ports of call. In the meantime, you need to go through all the patient's records, make sure all their details are completed correctly, their full name, the date and time of death, that sort of thing. Then, you need to go through the notes, document the names of any doctors who treated them during their last admission, so that someone involved in their care while they were alive can offer a cause of death. Start at the end and work backwards so that you're contacting the doctors who had the most recent input. Go through everything. Check if they've had any falls. operations or procedures that might have contributed to their death, as these cases need to go to the coroner. The next of kin have 5 days to come to the office, collect the paperwork, register the death, and there's a lot to do in that time. My head was spinning already. This was all stuff that happened in the background when someone died, things that people didn't really have any awareness of, but that were vital to the process. Wendy had more to tell me. Sometimes you can't get someone to do the certificate because it's just mobbed upon the wards. There are lots of locums, especially in A&E, and they can be even harder to track down. The doctors might not even remember the patient as they're so busy, which means we need to get as much in order as possible. And when people come here, what happens then? I asked. They'll obviously be upset, although you can never predict reactions, and some of them are confused about what we even are. We're a holding mortuary, not a working mortuary, but a few have got their ideas from Silent Witness. They think there's all sorts of forensic stuff going on here, that we're chopping people up and solving murders. You'll hear lots of weird things, and people have strange assumptions at times. Once they know it's entirely up to them whether they want to see the body, that does help. I tried not to have any expectations, but I've always had an interest in death. Hardly anyone wants to discuss it, and it's often shrouded in mystery. Now, I was in the centre of this veiled world, and all I could hope to do was put people at ease, to help them through such a trying time, and to offer support. Wendy interrupted my thoughts. Another thing, people often don't even want to hear the words die, or death, or dead. They'll say passed away, or gone over, and that's fine. They can use whatever words help them, but you need to make sure they know what's happened. They'll know, surely. They're in a mortuary. Grief does funny things. I've lost count of the number of times I've had to emphasise that the person is dead. You can't always use other words. You'll have to say, when X is dead, this will happen, or now that X is dead. It sounds harsh, but there are people who just won't accept it unless you're really factual. It doesn't mean that you're cold. It just means that they need to know this is it. There's no coming back. It did sound a bit cold, but it wasn't long before I realised the truth of it. People use so many euphemisms to soften the subject because we hide death in our society. We don't have conversations about it until we're forced to, which, for me, is a very unhealthy approach. However, on that first day, before I met anyone, I was just taking it all in. Remember, they don't have to see the body, but neither do you. You can have as much or as little involvement with the mortuary as you like. It's up to you. I nodded, but I'd made my mind up. This was something I knew I could do, and I already felt at home. It was vital that I familiarise myself with the viewing room, as well as all of the other workings of the mortuary. I wanted to be prepared to answer any questions and be comfortable with the whole setup. It would be awful if someone who was grieving felt that I was some sort of amateur. Just pop a pillow under their head and a blanket over them, said Wendy. The other covers get draped over the sides so that the family, or whoever is viewing, doesn't get too upset by thinking it's all very clinical. On that first day, I concentrated on learning how to arrange everything perfectly. I was told that the body had to be covered up to mid-chest so that the family could see their neck and face. Obviously, there were going to be cases where this wasn't practical. For instance, I knew that a young girl had been in the day before who had been hit on the side of the motorway. Her skull had completely caved in, And I was warned that, with similar cases, I'd have to be a bit more strategic with the sheets. Will people really want to do a viewing if someone has died like that? I asked. They have to be allowed to see them if they wish, even if we advise them that it could be traumatic, said Wendy. It was always up to the family. The only thing we could do, along with the police and the coroner's office, was to be completely honest about what they would see and advise against it, as much as we might want to scream, "No, don't do it. You'll be haunted forever." I could expect the majority of viewings to last about 30 minutes to an hour, but there might be some people who hardly stayed, and others who wanted much longer. The viewing room itself had nothing but chairs and a small vase of flowers until the covered trolley was brought in. It was an unadorned room, a blank slate for the story that would be told, the regrets, the love, and the grief which would play out within. I would meet the family outside of the viewing room, take their names and their relationship to the deceased, and then show them in. If the body was under the care of the coroner, then the visit would have to be supervised. Otherwise, the visitor or visitors could be left alone. I'd been given as much information as I could absorb for the time being, and it was time to do my first viewing. Thrown in at the deep end, the family who walked in had lost their grandma. It was a straightforward death. The old lady had been ill before she came into hospital and died quite quickly in the final stages of cancer before anyone had a chance to organise hospice care. There was a clear cause of death and no need for the coroner to be involved. It was a mixed blessing, really, as she'd been in a lot of pain. As soon as they came in and I walked over, the words came out of my mouth without thinking. "I'm so sorry for your loss." It's what we all say, isn't it? An automatic expression, a cliché, really. But from the first time I uttered it, and for every viewing from that moment on, I meant it. I was sorry. I did feel that their loss needed to be acknowledged immediately. I wasn't affected in a bad way at all by that first viewing. Everyone in the family, the woman's 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, and a grandson in his 20s, wept. But they also seemed to process it very well. They were really just there to say goodbye. There were no dramatics, no recriminations, nothing more or less than a final farewell to a loved one. They thanked me when they left, and I was satisfied that they had got what they needed from it. They were appreciative and respectful, and I suppose I expected that to be the case with every viewing that was going to happen. I didn't dwell on anything, but I did empathise. I had, of course, lost loved ones myself, but I wouldn't be able to compare every loss to someone I cared for, or I wouldn't be able to function. I guess that being in the middle of death like that can focus your mind, but you also need a degree of distance, or you'd be bawling your eyes out constantly for what had been lost in your own life, and the losses that were to come, too. As that day went on, and I saw more dead bodies than I'd come across in my life, I soon realised that I wasn't a squeamish person when it came to death. I'd had to grit my teeth and cover my nose when dealing with hoarders, but this was a different type of potentially uncomfortable situation, and it could have been something I might not have been able to deal with. Luckily, it didn't faze me at all. As my first week went on, I realised how little I knew about this world of the dead. I never really thought about it. When anyone I'd known had died, I think, after the initial grief or shock or relief if they'd been suffering, most of us move on to the funeral arrangements. We're either organising those ourselves, if it's a loved one, or preparing to go to one for friends or acquaintances. Being here brought me into the world in between. I realised that every single body tells a story. And perhaps that was what I had been drawn to all along. On my second day, the main thing I realised was that despite people knowing that their loved one has been in a fridge before the viewing, they can still be utterly shocked at how cold they are. "I can pull the blinds back and let you look through the window first," I offered. "It'll give you an idea of what to expect when you go in to see your mum, or even if it's the right thing to do." "No, we're fine," the son told me gruffly. "Just need to get this over and done with." His wife was more upset, dabbing at her eyes. "It might be better, John," she suggested, "so you're not shocked." "I'm not going to be bloody shocked, am I? I know she's dead. I know what I'm going to see." "Well, Mum will look like she's lying in a bed," I went on, "but I do have to warn you that she'll be extremely cold." He rolled his eyes. "Can we just go in?" His wife hung back a little more before following him in. He strode over to the body and lifted his mother's hand up, dropping it instantly. "Bloody hell! She's freezing!" he shouted. "What's going on here? She's like a block of ice." I'm not sure what he thought we'd been up to. I would find out in the days and weeks and months to follow that many people just couldn't take on board how cold bodies would be when their blood was no longer pumping. No matter how much I tried to warn them, no matter how I couched it, the fact that they were touching someone who had been in a fridge since they had died was shocking. It happened a lot. People would touch the body and be jolted by how it felt to them. You think you know what cold means, but until you touch a corpse that has just come out of a refrigerator, you have no idea. It's not just that they've been at a low temperature, it's also that their body isn't generating any heat at all. Additionally, there is often moisture coming out of their skin, which can look like sweat, making it even more shocking when the natural instinct is to touch their face or hold their hand, but they're like ice. In those early days, I only had everyday cases to deal with. I hadn't been warned that there might be other types. Maybe that was for the best. I don't think I ever had a line between what I expected grieving people to do and what I didn't. In my first week, I remember a woman calling up after a viewing and quietly asking, "Do you think you could pop back in and tell her I love her again?" "Of course I can," I told her. "I'll do that right now, and you call me back in 5 minutes so I can let you know it's done." I'd never lie to someone about things that are important to them like that. There's no rule book about how to grieve, and nor should there be. If someone needs something and I can help them, why wouldn't I? My colleagues were the same. We don't want anyone to leave with questions unanswered, with their imaginations running riot. Our respect doesn't end until the body leaves the mortuary. After a little while, still in my first month, I'd hover at the start of the viewing, as everyone tends to have questions. And if it looked as if they weren't going to follow the rules, I'd hover for even longer. The main issue which arose was the number of people who wanted to take pictures. That, obviously, isn't allowed at all. Yet there would be some who insisted it was a perfectly normal thing to do, and that I was being ridiculous for saying we couldn't let them. "Where's the harm?" pushed one man. "She's dead. She doesn't know, and she won't mind anyway." "I'm really sorry, but it's against our rules," I repeated. He thought about it for a minute. "FaceTime. That'll be okay, won't it? Just let her grandkids have a look." He wasn't the first to suggest that. And a lot of people do it covertly. With one family of 12, they were adamant there were dozens of other relatives who wanted to see the poor woman. They agreed to stick to the rules, but when I left to answer the phone, I got back to see them all with their phones out, snapping away, some of them posing at the side of her. It bewilders me why anyone would want to do that. But maybe it's a sign of the times. "Why can't we do it?" they would ask. "It's not appropriate," I'd reply. "Why? It's about dignity and respect. He can't consent. But the family wants to see what he looks like now, whether he looks different." He looked dead. That's how he looked. The very next one, after the FaceTiming family, was the complete opposite. It was a case that was with the coroner as an unexplained death. A young woman of only 25 had been found unresponsive in her bed that morning. Anyone who came in and was the same age as one of my kids hit hard, and this one was heartbreaking. Her mum wanted to see her that lunchtime, less than 4 hours after she had been found, and the police warned us that we'd have our work cut out, as the mum had severe mental health problems. "You're new, aren't you?" the officer said to me. "You'll have to watch her. She's volatile and can't be left on her own. Supervisor the whole time. The whole time." I agreed that I would, and prepared myself. The body wasn't in a bad state. We knew that she'd had a history of drug use, but the police hadn't seen any evidence of an intentional overdose when they found her. Her mum was broken from the moment she walked in, staggered in, really.